I've never told this story to anyone because I always thought that just speaking about it out loud would make it real, and I always wanted to forget. But now that I'm very, very old, I want to tell you, my little grandson, what happened to me so many, many years ago. May God have mercy on my soul for what I'm about to tell you. I was 22 years old, and my parents had convinced me to work as a counselor at a summer camp for kids. It was an old scout camp in the middle of nowhere, near a lake surrounded by dense forests. There was no cell service, but the camp director had a satellite phone for emergencies, so I thought there was nothing to worry about. I would spend a few weeks away from the city, make a little money, and probably even have some fun. At first, everything was pretty normal. The kids were full of energy, and the other counselors and I took them on hikes, organized outdoor games, and told ghost stories around the campfire. But one night, something changed. It was almost midnight, and most of the kids were sleeping in their tents, while I had volunteered for the first watch to make sure no one snuck out. A strange fog had formed over the lake, and the silence was unnatural, almost oppressive. Just as I was about to go into my tent to grab a sweater, I heard a sound, a rustling coming from the bushes. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It looked like a man, but he was completely still and staring in my direction. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. After a few seconds, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't say anything to anyone. I thought it was just my imagination or maybe a passing hiker. But the next day, a 17-year-old girl went up to a female counselor during lunch and told her something that made her blood run cold. "I saw a man watching us last night," she whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone would hear. The counselor asked her where she had seen him, and she pointed to the edge of the forest, exactly where I had seen the figure the night before. She tried to reassure the girl, telling her it was probably just an animal, but inside she knew that wasn't true. She decided to tell the other counselors, but one of them, Luke, laughed, saying they were just kids' stories and that she was probably feeding her imagination. That night I took the watch again. This time I brought a stronger flashlight with me. Around midnight, as I was walking among the tents, I heard the rustling again, coming from the woods. I pointed my flashlight toward the trees and saw the same figure from the night before. He was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and he seemed to be holding a long staff or scepter. I approached cautiously, but when I shined the light on his face, I couldn't see any defined features. It was as if his face was covered by an unnatural shadow, something that the light couldn't penetrate. Then, without making any noise, he disappeared into the trees again. At that point, I was sure it wasn't just my imagination. I decided to wake up the other counselors and tell them what I had seen, but once again they thought I was exaggerating or just trying to scare them. The next night, something even stranger happened. Around 3 in the morning, one of the boys started screaming from his tent. Luke and I ran to calm him down. Trembling, the boy told us that a man had come to his tent and whispered his name. He said the man had a hood and eyes that shone in the dark. By then, I couldn't ignore the facts anymore. I decided to talk to the camp director, but his face visibly darkened when I mentioned the man in the woods. He asked if it had happened near the old cabin, an abandoned building at the edge of the camp that, according to him, no one was supposed to go near. That evening, while the rest of the camp was asleep, I decided to go to the cabin alone. I wanted to find out who or what was haunting the kids, and by then, even me. I approached the cabin cautiously, illuminating the entrance with my flashlight and, at the window, I saw a sight that froze me in place. A woman standing behind another terrified woman. What was she doing to her? What was happening inside that cursed house? I couldn't turn back. I had to know. I gathered my courage, trembling, and went inside. Inside, everything was dark and dusty. It seemed empty, but then I noticed something on the floor. Drawings, strange symbols traced with something red, as if they were drawn in blood. I began to hear a dull noise, anguished screams all around me, drilling into my brain, and yet there was no one. I thought I was going crazy. I started to feel a sensation so bizarre, yet real and terrifying. I could see them, not with my eyes, but in my mind. Unspeakable sufferings, unutterable tortures, brutal murders, and unnameable evil lived in that house where time seemed to lose meaning. That place was evil itself, feeding on human suffering. The house was mocking me. I tried to get out the door, but the handle seemed not to work. Then, looking up, I realized there was no door. I started running, as I'd never run before, but the more I ran, the more the floor pulled me back. And then I saw it, in a corner, a dark figure with eyes full of an empty darkness that seemed to consume everything around. It was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand, but not with its mouth. It didn't even have one, but I could hear it, and among the garbled words I heard one word clearly: leave. I turned around and, how was it possible? I was no longer inside the cabin, but in the middle of the woods. Who was that creature? What was that house? Why was I still alive? With 1,000 unanswered questions in my head, I ran toward the camp, never looking back. The next morning, I asked the director to let me go. I didn't tell him anything, and in fact, I hadn't told anyone until today. From that day, I never went back to that camp, and even now, every time I close my eyes to sleep, he is there, with his eyes fixed on mine. I don't know if it's my punishment for wanting to know too much or a warning to make sure I never forget.